This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. In this episode, we share a session from Validation Week on the topic of integrating risk into change control. Everything we do in this industry should take into account risk. Our guest, Alan Golden, talks about the changes driven by risk and conversely, risk updates driven by change, as well as risk integration. This episode will also be available on YouTube and through the IVT Network's product page, where you can download the video and follow along with the slides.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Golden, and I'd like to thank IVT for the opportunity to speak at this conference. I have spent a career in the medical device industry, 16 years in basic research, and 15 years in quality assurance. In my quality assurance role, I have most of my experience in change control, risk management, verification and validation of medical devices, and process and test method validation. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is the integration of risk into change control. And as you heard Roberta say in the prior presentation, everything we do should be based on risk. The FDA demands it. European governing bodies demand it. And this is true whether you're in medical devices or in pharma. And my talk today is applicable to both areas or anything in between, like combination products. So the last position I held in industry, I managed QA for on-market support and operations, where your life is change control. Something happens in the factory, you get an investigation or a CAPA, and you end up having to change something. Something happens in the field, you need to change something. And this is what I literally lived with for the last 15 years of my career. So we came up with some, I think, very unique ways of integrating risk into the change control process. And I'd like to share with you some of those techniques. The idea here is not only we talk a little bit about theory, and that's all well and good, but you're able to take something back to your shop where you can actually implement some of these things immediately if you wanted to again, help you integrate risk into the change process. So let's talk a little bit about the overview of the talk. We'll talk about, what is risk management, but I will tell you this is not a comprehensive risk management refresher. That would be another couple of hours, and we don't have that kind of time. We're going to talk about changes that are driven by changes in risk. We're going to talk about risk updates that are driven by changes. And we're going to talk about the implementation of risk integration into your change control process. Why is this important? And then I'll end with a few examples of FDA warning letters, always everyone's favorite subject, to show you where the FDA will come after you if you do not do appropriate assessments of risk when you make changes. Again, I can't see the chat during this presentation, but at the end, we'll hopefully have some time to answer some questions. So if you have a question during the course of the presentation, throw it in the chat, and Elise will help me at the end get those answered. So without any further ado, let's get into the topic. So what is risk management? Now, this is going to sound a little stupid, but risk management is managing your risks. First of all, you have to know them. So at some point during the development of your product, or as you manage your product when it's on market, you have to understand what risks you have. You have to know the consequences of those risks. So if something is a risk, what happens if that event happens? So again, you have to have either a good guess or some actual knowledge from predicate products or from your own research. You have to know how to control those risks. So again, if I know I've got a situation which could potentially lead to a hazard, what measures of control do I put in place? What do I do to control those risks? You need to keep track of them. I mean, a lot of people think that your risk management documentation is something you kind of get together during development and then you're done. That's not true. Risk management is a living document. It lives for the life of the product all the way through removal of that product from market, if that ever happens. So you need to keep track of all your risks, and those change as the product continues its life and during the product life cycle. You need to update that risk profile as needed. As I mentioned, your risk management documentation is a living document. You don't just do it once and put it away. It is constantly updated as that is needed. And of course, in our quest for continual improvement, we need to update and improve the risk management process all the time. Come up with new ways to do things, come up with better ways to document. There are new tools being developed all the time. There are some classic ones we'll talk about in a bit. But again, if you come up with a better way to do something, by all means do it. And again, I'm hoping the tool I'm going to give you today, you can integrate into your risk management process. So how bad is a risk, right? So risk is equal to the severity of the harm times the probability of that actually happening. So a severity is the measure of the possible consequences of a hazard. And taking a step back, who is that hazard to? It's to your customer or to the patient. There also are hazards and risks involved in manufacturing. If you're dealing with things that are caustic or toxic or biohazardous, you certainly want to have risk management available in your process and in your manufacturing documentation. The probability of an occurrence is, again, how often is it going to happen? What's the probability of seeing that particular situation? And again, this comes right out of ISO 14971, which is the ISO document for risk management in medical devices, but it's the same thing for pharmaceuticals. So severity, there is no industry-wide standard. You can't open up a document and say, well, if this happens, this is the severity. It is incumbent on the manufacturer to define this clearly. And since severity tends to be a medical issue, you've caused harm to someone, you're probably going to want to have that either decided on or looked over by someone in the medical field. Hopefully you've got someone who's got an MD on your staff, or someone you can have as a consultant who can sign off on that documentation to say, yes, if this happens, this is the medical severity. It does require that clinical understanding of harm. If you are not signing off that with someone who is capable, i.e. a medical doctor, you can be open to audit observations for, well, how did you know? I mean, you're not a doctor. So it's very important to either have someone on staff or have a consultant come in and make sure that they sign off on that medical consequence of harm. And this is the worst case reasonably expected. Not the best case, but the worst case. And I use the word reasonably. And again, I'm not a big fan of LY words because they're a little fuzzy. But in this case, I think you can use the term reasonably expected. Again, if you have actual knowledge from things that have happened in the field, that becomes much more precise. But again, initially, at least, it's the worst case reasonably expected. So probability, it's the probability of harm. So the probability of harm to a customer, if it's a medical device, maybe it's the person who's going to be using the syringe. You may have noticed if you've all gotten vaccines recently, most of the syringes now were these self-capping syringes because a lot of harm was done when clinicians tried to recap a needle and they ended up getting stuck, which was a problem. So what's the probability of that harm happening? What's the probability of a hazard, which is the probability of that situation occurring that would cause the harm? The probability of the hazardous situation happening. So if I have a medical device that I have to plug into the wall, what's the probability that I'm not shielded correctly? That's the whole situation is going to happen. What's the probability of the power going out into an infusion pump? So again, does it need a battery backup as a mitigation? So these are the things, the probability of a hazard situation that you need to keep in mind all the time. What's the probability of failure? And that's typically in the medical device industry where you've got a thing that can actually fail, whether it's a pump or some other device that could fail. This also is true in the factory. If you've got some instrumentation that's say filling bottles or extruding tubing, as Roberta mentioned, what's the probability of that failing? So the probability of harm is defined as the likelihood that any hazard or hazardous situation will lead to a harm. Now, this can be quantitative or qualitative, but I will tell you, in my opinion, a good qualitative measure is preferred to an inaccurate quantitative measure. And again, you heard Roberta talk about, medium, high, or low risk. So if I have a really good and justified low, medium, or high, that is better to a 4 or an 8 or a 3. I don't know what that means unless you've defined it very, very clearly. So again, if you've got a good way to measure these things in a quantitative way, fabulous. If not, a good qualitative measure is preferred. It should encompass the circumstances and the entire sequence of events for initiating the cause through the occurrence of the harm. Rarely is it one thing. So you need to understand the entire sequence of events that may lead to a harm. Presumption. You have a thorough risk analysis for your current products. I know that may be a bad assumption, but hopefully you've got a risk analysis. In the medical device world, in a product design state, you probably have or should have a design FMEA or some other tool. I tend to favor FMEAs, failure mode effects analyses, but there are many other tools, fishbone diagrams, fault tree analysis, many other tools that can be used. So don't take that as you must have an FMEA. It's the one that I tend to favor, but again, there are many other tools. You should have some kind of manufacturing and process risk documentation. And that's typically to the ability to get out a good product, but also to the potential of your manufacturing personnel. And how about the use of the product by the intended user in an intended environment? Do you have some kind of human factors FMEA that you have? If it's a device that's going to have an interface with a person, if they have to set something up, if they have to connect tubing, what's the possibility of them screwing that up? And even in the pharmaceutical end, what's the possibility of an overdose? What's the possibility of an underdose? What happens if you have expired product in the field? So again, you need to understand the risks of all of these things and have them documented. So again, another presumption, your company has a good process for complaint handling, CAPA, product and process improvements, because all those things lead into change control. Again, we'll talk about triggers in a minute. So integrating risk into the change control process means exploring the links and the synergy among risk management, complaint handling, CAPA, change control, which leads to something very important, which are change impact assessments. And again, I am not going to get into a lot of detail on change impact assessments. That's another entire topic, an hour and a half or so of change impact assessments, which we don't have time for today. But again, your risk assessment in your change control process should be part of the impact assessment for the change, an integral part. So again, what triggers risk management updates? Customer complaints. I mean, if you've got a product in the field and customers are complaining about it, there may be an unforeseen situation that you didn't anticipate that the customers have found. And of course, you never want your customers doing your QC for you, but as you get more product out in the field, as more and more people use your product, you start to see the tails of that curve a little bit more than you probably did during clinicals. This is very, very true, especially in pharmaceuticals, where you've got a limited number of people during a clinical trial, and now this drug is being taken by millions of people, and now you start to see the rarer events. So again, those things can trigger risk management updates. Internal failures and non-conformance investigations. These things always trigger some form of risk management update. If you had an internal failure and you launched into a CAPA, you may need to look at your production risk. You need to look at your risk of getting good product out the door. Medical device reports, MDRs, and vigilance reports in the pharmaceutical industry. So again, if you are reporting hazardous situations in the field, if you are reporting harm, false positive, false negative results, those kinds of things for devices, pump failures for devices, or you've got drug interactions that you didn't anticipate. These things usually will trigger risk management updates. Regulatory agency audit issues. If you've had the regulatory agency come in and they've said you've got a problem, obviously that's going to trigger some updates. Guidance documents. We get regulatory guidance documents coming out all the time, which make changes to how you're thinking about risk management. And medical and clinical guidelines change. And again, this is where you need to have a medical person on staff to help you understand when clinical guidance changes. So again, other triggers, off-label use. You have an instance or lots of instances where your customers are using your product in an off-label use, whether that's a pharmaceutical or a medical device. Competitor product issues. If you've got competitors who have a similar device on the market and they're having issues, you need to take a step back and say, well, could I be having those same issues? New published standards, of course, environmental standards or requirements. A couple of years ago, the European Union upgraded all of its hazardous waste disposal guidance and reporting information, which triggered huge changes in risk management. And then general awareness. Are you aware of something changing? If you are, you need to take action. All right. So will newly identified risks require new modes of control, changes to manufacturing processes, process specifications, test methods or specifications, product design, shipping or storage conditions, expiration dating? Instructions for use. This is a big one. Do you need to change your instructions for use? So again, you need to understand these things. Do you need new modes of control to control newly identified risks? All right. We're going to talk now about how we will explore how changes can drive a look at the impact to risk management. And again, you've got a process for change control. Now, again, from a change control procedure process, it can be paper, it can be electronic, carrier pigeon. It really doesn't matter. As long as you have a process, you can find what you're looking for and you've got everything written down. Remember, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So what is change control? We're going to take a little steps to the side, a brief reminder. Change control is the methods and procedures you establish to identify, assess, approve, and implement changes to a product's design, packaging, labeling, manufacture, testing, storage, shipping, use, pretty much anything you can imagine. If you've got a document that talks to it and something changes, you are in the change control world, right? So lots of drivers of change. We've talked about a lot of these drivers. Customer complaints are a huge driver of change, huge. Because obviously you want to make your customers happy. So if they're complaining about something, if it's a one-off, you may want to just file it away. But if it's everybody's complaining about the same thing, you may think about making a change, even if it really doesn't end up creating a new hazard. Kappa. If you're in Kappa land, and I spent a lot of time in Kappa land, something has to change to revive the Kappa, right? To resolve the Kappa, sorry. So you can't leave a Kappa unresolved. So you have to come up with a Kappa plan. You have to come up with a plan of action, and that usually involves making some change at some point. Process improvements. These are my favorites, right? Where you're making something one way and all of a sudden you realize you can improve that process. You can make it faster, cheaper, better, right? Or you've got the great opportunity to say, hey, look, you know, we're selling 3 times as much as we thought we were going to sell. We need to scale up. That's a good reason for change. And now you're going to have to maybe do new process validations for bigger tank sizes. All that's part of your change control. Now, you don't, again, there are also situations where you have processes that aren't working because they've been maybe instituted too quickly or whatever, but then you need to make the improvements to get them to work better. There are market needs, like I mentioned. Maybe you are selling more or less product. Maybe you've got to remove product from market. That's also part of change control. And again, there's regulatory changes. The FDA comes in and says you need to do this because this is a problem, or they've made new guidelines, or there is a new CFR out there, or ISO guidance changes. Whatever you're following, or whatever multiple areas you're following, you may need to make changes to your product, and that goes through change control. So in the device world, I will say, for those of you in the device world, there are 2 types. There are 2 flavors of change. There are things that change the product's actual design, and these are formulation changes, storage, specifications, design inputs, testing specifications. these tend to be things that if you change something, really does change the product. Then there's something that I used to term not a design change. And these are changes in manufacturing, typically with no changes in formulations or product specifications. So I can scale something up or down. Is it still change control? Absolutely, because I'm usually changing manufacturing documents. Do I need to do some work to potentially verify that that change is good? Yes, but I'm not changing my design. What's in the box at the end of the day is the same thing. I can change vendors, especially if I've got multiple vendors already on a material specification with very little work. Now, if I do change a vendor to a different, from same material, different vendor, I've got a lot of work to do to show that that new material functions the same way. And be very careful with the term like for like in change control, because that can get you into trouble without additional work. But I can change vendors. It's not changing my product design. I have to show, however, that my product at the end is the same as it was before. And again, if I change my labeling with no change to intended use, i.e. marketing comes in and says, I'm sorry, we want the label to be yellow instead of green. Okay, fine. I haven't really changed the product at the end. And this is not so much true in the pharmaceutical side, because you don't design a drug the same way you design a thing, design a device. But again, you could potentially categorize these differently. So you need to assess, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, the impact of the change. Both types of changes, I mentioned, whether they are change to design or not, require you to assess the impact of that change. You don't want to fix something and break something else. And I think we've all seen examples of that if we've been in the industry long enough, where you change something and inadvertently something else breaks, or you change something and you think there should be no impact, there turns out to be impact to your product or some other product. And here's the key. A big part of that assessment is the evaluation of the change of the risk profile of that product. That's critical. So the effect of the change should not be to increase the overall risk of the product. So, this is kind of a joke picture, but if I decided to change the orientation of the barrel of this gun, I have certainly increased the risk of the product, especially to the user. I don't want to do that. And again, you should not be able to change the overall risk. It should not go up. It should stay the same or it go down. And that's to the manufacturing process, the end user, the patient, whatever. So again, your assessment of the risk of a change should indicate at the end that nope, the risk did not go up. It either stayed the same, which was acceptable before, hopefully, or it went down. So all changes should include a complete review of the product's current risk file. So I'm going from A to B, I'm changing whatever. I need to go back into the product's risk file and look. Am I changing any? Is there new changes to risk to design? Any process changes? Do I have human factors changes, which again in the device world are critical? Is there any medical risk change? I want to bring my physician in, go over this with him or her, and say, "Hey, I'm making this change. Do you think there's any change to the medical risk?" And again, an MD is qualified to do that. I personally would not be. I am not an MD. So assessment of risk. So you ask yourself a couple of questions. Does the change add or remove a control measure? Add or remove a process step? Update, change, or clarify labeling? And by the way, just as an aside, the worst way to manage risk is labeling. And most of you will probably giggle about that, but it's true. It's because nobody reads the labels. Nobody reads the labeling, at least not the entire label, right? It's a terrible way to manage risk. It is your last resort. Is there a change to the user interface? If there is, you may want to think about, am I decreasing the risk for the user pushing the wrong button or not being able to hear an alarm, whatever. But you need to answer these questions. Importantly, answers to these questions should help drive what studies you need to verify or validate that change. So as part of your change control impact assessment, assessment of risk is one of the primary drivers as to what you need to do to show that that change has either no impact or a positive impact on your product. Okay, so as a result of the review, do you need to update any of the product's risk management files? Do you need an updated medical opinion? And how do you document all this? Okay, so a bit of advice. If your risk management documentation on that product you are changing is not complete or up to date, it makes this process so much harder. You may end up creating, remediating a complete risk management file if one does not exist just because you're making a change. So my advice, start risk management early in your development process. Whether you're a device manufacturer or a pharmaceutical manufacturer, start getting those documents in place. Remember, it's a living document. As you learn more about your product, they are always updatable through change control, but they are always updatable. So again, get that risk management process started early. Just some advice. So this brings us to the tool that I'm going to talk to you about today. I know it's kind of a long-winded way to get to the sort of the main point of integration of risk into change management. So this was something that was developed basically to help simplify and focus the process of a risk assessment, risk management around a change. So a tool that you can use to look at the impact of risk on your change is what I'm going to call a risk or change specific risk assessment, which is basically looking at risk before and after the change in a very specific way. And you can use whatever risk management tools you normally would do to do risk management. It works with FMEAs, fault tree analysis, fishbone diagrams, and most of the tools that you might have in your shop. It also means, it doesn't mean that you have to use the same tools. If you tend to be, a fault tree kind of person for most of your risk management, but you want to use an FMEA for this, that's fine. It doesn't matter. But so I'm not telling you to use any specific tool. My example will be with an FMEA because that's what I'm most familiar with. But again, don't go back to your shop and say, this guy at this meeting said I have to use an FMEA. You don't. You use whatever tools you're familiar with, you're comfortable with to do this change-specific risk assessment. So it assesses the risk only around the change. It links to existing risk records. This is very important. You have to have existing risk records for it to link to. Otherwise, you have no basis to start. It compares the risk directly before and after the change. It is justification for the conclusions and justification for conclusions, refers to objective evidence. So I've done my risk assessment, I draw a conclusion, and I'm going to point to objective evidence to verify that conclusion. I'm not going to guess. So here is an example of a change-specific risk assessment. And again, I'm using an FMEA. The words in here, I made up a bunch of fake or sort of fantasy things. I don't have a gizmo that does this. It doesn't, because I couldn't use a real example. But here is an example. Basically, look at the columns, and that's what's important. So if you take a look at the first 5 columns under change detail, first of all, I write down what is my requirement or function. So what is this thing I'm changing supposed to do? What's my proposed change? I'm going to do something to that. In this case, I'm changing a method, which something is calibrated. What are my potential failure modes? Now, in any FMEA, you may have multiple failure modes under the same sort of row, and that's okay. So pick up all your potential failure modes. You're then going to have another column, potential cause of the failure, and you're going to have a different cause for each failure mode. I only have one listed here for brevity. And then I have a column that says potential effects. What happens if, right, this happens? I actually have that potential failure. I have this, the cause happens. What happens if that does happen? So again, I then have a set of columns that say, here is my risk mitigation, my risk assessment prior to the change. I have a control measure. And then I have 3 columns, severity, occurrence, and risk level. Now, you'll notice that I do not include detection. Basically, I believe that a detection column is a little bit of a crutch. You can have, major severity with, it's going to happen all the time. The risk level is very high, but look, I have a great test and I can detect it. I think what that does is it allows you to get away with having situations that you have not adequately controlled, and you're relying on testing. And as we know, testing is not 100%. Validated methods or processes, as Roberta pointed out, still have a confidence level. There will still be some failures in testing. And if you have something that happens a lot with a high risk, you're going to miss. So I tend not to include detection. What's my severity? How often do I think it's going to happen, or have I seen it happen? And what's my risk level? And that's severity times occurrence. And you've seen those little tables. And then I have a set of columns that say post-change. So what's my post-change control measure? Now you'll notice that it's the same test method, but I versioned it up. Okay, so I've done something to my test method. I still have, the severity is going to be the same. So I still have an occurrence level of improbable. I still have a risk level of low in this case, in this example. And then the most important part of this, I have a column that says comments, verification, or validation. So what did I do to show that I'm still at improbable and I am still at low, which means I have not changed the risk profile of this particular product at this time. And again, I have an explanation here, and then I'm going to point you, notice all the way at the bottom, I'm going to point you to a test method validation. And again, typically there's some kind of indexing number for the test method validation. If it was a verification study, if it was another clinical, if it was a supplier audit, whatever, I'm going to point to all of my objective evidence to draw this conclusion. And I'm going to include this change-specific risk assessment as part of my change package. It's again, I'm also going to include it in the product's risk management documentation, because it is part of the product's risk management documentation. And you'll notice that I have a change in test method. I'm actually going to go into the product's original risk documentation. I'm going to find this thing, I'm going to find this row, and I'm going to update it based on my little risk assessment here. So my product risk documentation in whole is an action item I'm going to put into update as part of my change plan. But this little piece is what I'm going to do to determine whether or not my risk is acceptable after the change. So again, none of this does any good if you don't do it. I mean, that makes perfect sense, right? You need to have a trigger somewhere in your change control process to ensure that this assessment is done. And that should be part of your OP or your SOP for your impact assessment for change, whether it's a checklist or a form or something that the team is going to work through, and they're going to get to change-specific risk assessment. I need to do that. And again, it should be a trigger in your impact assessment process. All right, so I'm going to go back just for a bit. I will tell you that in my experience, when we have had a situation, we've had major changes that regulatory has said we have to submit a supplement to the product's PMA before we can make the change. We actually had to get approval from the FDA. When we sent this in along with the PMA supplement, the FDA loved it because we didn't send them a 60 or 80 or more page FMEA and say, please see line 386. We sent them this, and it focused their attention on the fact that we really thought about risk management in terms of our change control process. They liked that because they're telling you to do it. This is objective evidence that you did it. They liked it because, oh, look, they did all this analysis and they point to why it's okay to make this change from a risk perspective. It was clear, it was upfront, and we never got questions about this simply because they got it. It was right there. They didn't have to go digging through hundreds of pages of FMEAs to find the one line we'd changed. During audits, we would bring these up when a question would come up about change control. And if you think about when auditors or investigators will come into your site, what are the things they always ask for? One of those things is all your change control, whether that's product specific or from the last time they were there. This is along with all your customer complaints and CAPA. But the reason they're asking for these things is it's all your dirty laundry. It's all hanging out in one place for them to look at. Because, if things are running beautifully, you're not going to have customer complaints. You're not going to have CAPA. You don't need change control. Nothing's going to change. Well, what the investigators want to find is what's not working particularly well, and this is where they're going to find it. Whenever they pulled change packages to look at, when we implemented change-specific risk assessments, great. Now, other things may have been a problem, but this was not. All right. So I'm going to end with some examples of why you need to do this. If you've never looked on the FDA's website where they post 483 or they post warning letters, it's a useful activity. You can filter by industry or by company. I have all the company names in these deleted because I don't want to embarrass anybody if you happen to be from one of these companies. And a lot of the other details are not on the website. But again, this gives you an idea of the kind of things the agency can cite you for if you do not have appropriate risk management in your change control process. And I'm not going to read these to you word for word necessarily. So, okay. So this was from June 7th of 2011. Adverse event reporting and corrections. And this is a device example. And removals process did not include measures to ensure that any new hazards or risks identified through the product's life cycle were added to the risk management file. So they, basically reported corrections and removals and didn't update the risk management file. This is a very, very simple observation. The firm's action plan includes revising. And remember, you only get a warning letter after you've responded to an initial 483 observation on Form 483, and that the FDA does not think your response is adequate. Again, for creating as needed product risk management procedures to ensure the regulatory compliance, et cetera. Developing, conducting instructor-led training and revised procedures. The planning revisions have not been fully communicated or approved through your firm's approval process, and the implementation of the required changes has not been performed. This is one of the worst things you can do, which is tell the FDA you're going to do something and then not do it. You're going to get a warning letter every time. So again, very simple. They didn't put anything into the risk management file based on the product lifecycle changes, and they got a warning letter for it. So this is, again, August 9th, 2011, a little later in the year. Your firm's risk analysis conducted and again, I left out the project was inadequate, that your firm failed to document specific actions to reduce risk. Again, addition of warning labels, validation studies, design modifications, and this is another device example, obviously, and failed to assess residual risk after completion of activities intended to reduce risk. And here's the better part. those residual, if these assets residual risk, the access to residual risk was required by your own operating procedures. So again, they're doing a couple things. A, they didn't do anything, and B, they didn't do it even though their procedure said they were going to do it, which is a problem. And again, the redesigned product was transferred to production and they found a change order. That's how they found this, was in the change order. They went through the change order and said, oh, that's great. And where's your risk management? And they got cited for it. So for those of you in the pharma universe, regarding item 1 and 2 of this letter, we know that your response included a commitment to retrain personnel. And by the way, for those of you involved in CAPA or any response to the FDA, the weakest response you can give is we're going to retrain everybody. And that seems to be common situation. Oh, we screwed up, we'll retrain. It's never that simple. It really is. And it's putting the blame on all the operators, and it's usually not their fault. Usually it's bad procedures or whatever. But again, so be careful there. Revise procedures and use of pre-made agar plates to avoid. Your response is inadequate because your firm failed to conduct a comprehensive risk assessment of a poor aseptic process and inadequate environmental monitoring. So again, just because I'm now going to start using pre-made plates and not making my own, I haven't addressed all this other stuff, and I certainly haven't looked at the risk in the change. So again, what happened? Bingo, they got a warning letter. And my last one is, again, another device one. Again, it's my world, so I look at these more often. Failure to establish and maintain procedures for validating design. And by the way, the agency will usually cite you against a regulation. Specifically, your risk analysis is incomplete, and the risk analysis was not reevaluated after multiple software changes. So I have a device that has some software, probably customer-facing software. I made multiple changes. And that's this human factors thing, potentially, if it's an interface change. But how do I know the risk hasn't changed? I didn't do a risk analysis. So this is why, again, it is critical to do that proper risk analysis around your change. And I've given you a tool to help you do that. Oops, another pharma example. Sorry, I thought I had more than 4. Again, dissolution results using the new methods are approximately higher than results of the same lots using the inappropriate method, and you have not provided a risk analysis of the lots that were analyzed with the current method, or determine the acceptability of product analyzed with the former, apparently inappropriate method. So I've changed a method, I got a better result, but what's my risk of product that's still on the market? What's my risk of the new product? Again, same situation. I'm gonna skip the rest of these. You can read them on your own. You have the slides. So risk management should be part of your thinking every single day. Come into work, set your computer up, go eat your first cup of coffee, and start thinking about how you can reduce risk. It should happen every day in everything you do, especially in change control. You should be constantly aware of how changes affect the risk profile of your product, constantly. And therefore, how changes you make to your product affect the people and the patients who use them. Isn't that why we're here, right? We are here to produce products that help people. That's the cool part about our industries. We actually make things that help people, but they also shouldn't hurt them. So again, our jobs are to reduce risk as much as possible and to constantly monitor that risk regardless of the process we're running. And in change control, it is extremely important. So I think I'm pretty much on time. We certainly will have time for Q&A. I will drop my slides off and we'll let Elise come back on in a minute. But that's it. So if you have additional questions, if you would like to contact me at any time, this is my email and that is my cell phone number. I would be more than happy to entertain more complex questions that you think might be inappropriate for now, or you want to talk about anything else. Please feel free to contact me. I'd like, again, to thank you all for your attention this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are, and to thank IVT for the invitation to speak to you. It has been a true pleasure, and I hope you guys really enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks again, and if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alan, for that fantastic presentation. It was very informative, and I hope our audience felt the same way. So we'll now begin the live Q&A. So for any attendees joining us, please feel free to submit a question using the Q&A button. We do have a couple that have come in already. So the first question, Alan, that has been asked is, what would be your best recommendation to analyze and deal with, quote, like-for-like changes?
You know, that's a superb question, and it was the bane of my existence for years. So you have to, first of all, in your procedures, somehow define like for like. And ahead of that also, you need to prove like for like. And that can be hard to do. I mean, if you've got a vendor who has done nothing but change a catalog number and it's the same product and you can show that through a vendor audit or through a questionnaire, it's the same thing, we just changed the catalog number, great. It's like for like. That's easy. And it's a very low impact. If I have a vendor, as an example, who's moved the processing of that component to a new site, or they're making it in a different way, and they're telling you it's the same thing, it's really not. You need to prove that by doing appropriate studies. So you have a range. Be very, very careful about like for like. My suggestion would be to treat like for like in a very skeptical manner. If you can prove it, great. Or if you really can show that it truly is a like for like situation. But you have to document that thought process. So again, that's part of your change impact assessment. Hope that answered the question.
Great. Thank you, Alan. So the next question I will read out, but a reminder again for attendees to click the Q&A button if they're going to ask a question. So this question reads, with the high volume of changes, how do you keep your risk assessment updated?
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I will tell you that one of the years when I was at Abbott, I personally, and I had a team of 3 people, I personally saw 800 change requests in 1 year. That's an indication that probably made too many changes, but it is not easy. Now, we were fortunate that we actually had a dedicated risk management team that worked with us as part of the change process that handled most of that documentation. But otherwise, if you do not have people who are dedicated to risk management, you have to do it yourself. And it's hard and it takes a lot of time. It can actually be a justification for additional personnel if you really start getting behind, because you don't want to do that. There's no easy answer to that question.
Great. Thank you, Alan. So it looks like those are all the questions we've received. Maybe people have more complicated questions they want to ask you directly, it sounds like.
No problem.
Yeah, well, we appreciate your time. Do you have any closing remarks you would like to provide?
No, not really. I think that working through your change control process and coming up with a really, really good template for impact assessments is critical. If anyone wants more information on that, please contact me independently. It's something that takes a long time to put together and a lot of buy-in, but I think it's something well worth it. And the whole integration of risk management in that is part of that impact assessment in your change. It has to be done. The agencies expect it. And I wish I could sugarcoat it and say it isn't a lot of work. It is, but a change-specific tool will go a long way to help that documentation without getting muddled in what can be, like I said, hundreds of pages of risk documentation. So hopefully that helped a little bit. Again, feel free to contact me at any point.
We did actually get 2 more questions come in, and since we still have time, I will ask those if that's all right with you, Alan.
Absolutely. I mean, I can see them here actually. Amazing.
Perfect.
Do you get?
Could you read? Yeah, I'll just read out the first one to make
Sure.
sure everyone can see. So the first question is, do you get much pushback from designers or manufacturers on not including detection in your original evaluation of overall risk?
Some. The answer to that in a short one-syllable answer is some. But if the risk documentation at your site, if your SOP for risk documentation doesn't include detection, you just don't use it. And that's something coming out of ISO 14971, which is something that we lived with. If you want to include detection, it's not wrong to include detection. So what does your site, what does your company want to do as far as that goes? We decided to eliminate it. Again, we saw no ill effects in doing that because, again, I am trying to mitigate risk the best I can. And sometimes it is detection. Sometimes I do have a test method in place, but I never relied on detection if I had a high risk along with a high occurrence. If my occurrence tended to be low, I think you're okay there. So again, what does your company and everyone else want to do? And there's no right or wrong answer there. A lot of people do include detection and the agencies accept that fine. Okay.
Yeah, great. So there is a final question there. If you'd like to answer it, Alan?
Sure. I said, why is risk management process documentation heavy and not test heavy to provide the required adequate evidence? Oh, it is test heavy. Absolutely. I'm not saying that risk management is the get all end all. If you have to do verification, you have to do revalidation, additional validation, supplier auditing, whatever you need to do, which in a testing phase to ensure that that change is appropriate and doesn't break something else and fixes the problem, you absolutely have to do that. What risk management does is help drive what studies that you probably should do, or that help you think through what studies may be needed. I mean, in the device world, we're going to go back to product requirements and user needs and all this kind of stuff. But we also want to look at risk and say, well, am I increasing my risk? And is there something I need to do to test to show that my risk hasn't changed? So it's not more or less. Testing and risk management, very co-equal. You have to do both. And again, that should be part of your risk assessment process, should be part of your impact assessment template, impact assessment thinking for every change you do.
Once again, we thank our guest, Alan Golden, for sharing his knowledge with us. I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. Most importantly, thanks to you, our valued listeners. With your help, we saw tremendous growth in 2021. Please share this episode with your friends, colleagues, and online networks, and don't forget your 5-star review in your podcast player of choice. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd also love to hear from you on that. If you liked this training style episode, please visit www.shop.ivtnetwork.com/product for a complete list of available training videos, on-demand webinars, and industry tools. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, make it a great week.